Imagine a peaceful afternoon at a busy local mall, a day just like any other. People are lost in their routines, shopping, chatting, and simply going about their day. But in this seemingly ordinary setting, an unexpected storm is brewing, one that will change everything for a kind-hearted elderly woman named Mrs. Margaret Lewis. She's a beloved member of her community, known for her gentle spirit, her soft gray hair framing a face of warmth and kindness. Mrs. Margaret, who moves through the world with quiet grace and a reliance on her trusty cane, enjoys her independence and cherishes these small, everyday errands. Today, as she strolls through the aisles, filling her bag with essentials like milk, bread, vegetables, and her favorite herbal tea, she feels a sense of contentment. Little does she know that this peaceful outing is about to take a terrifying turn. What starts as a simple shopping trip quickly becomes a fight for her dignity, leaving her shaken and vulnerable, until an unexpected ally steps in, bringing justice in a way no one in the mall could have anticipated. Stay tuned to see how this dramatic story unfolds and witness a son's determination to stand up against prejudice and protect his mother. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this. Join us on this journey and be part of our community. You won't want to miss what happens next. The shopping mall bustled with life on a mild afternoon, a typical day where people moved about with an air of routine. Shoppers strolled through the aisles, their footsteps creating a lively rhythm on the tiled floors. The sounds of casual conversation mixed with the soft hum of background music, filling the air with a sense of calm. It was an unassuming scene, the kind of peaceful backdrop that makes it hard to believe anything out of the ordinary could ever happen. Yet, beneath this serene surface, an unexpected storm was quietly brewing. Mrs. Margaret Lewis, a soft-spoken, elderly woman in her 70s, made her way through the mall's aisles with graceful poise. Her years showed in her gentle features and soft, silver-gray hair, which framed her face with warmth and kindness. Known in her community as a caring and dignified presence, Margaret was the kind of person who left an impression without ever raising her voice. Despite her age, she cherished her independence, often going about her daily errands alone, relying only on her walking cane to help her navigate the world at her own measured pace. Today, Margaret's shopping list was simple, just a few essentials: milk, a loaf of bread, some fresh vegetables, and her favorite herbal tea. She moved slowly but with purpose, her cane tapping softly against the floor as she took her time, browsing and savoring these small moments of freedom. There was something fulfilling about being able to do these small tasks herself, even if her body no longer had the energy or speed of her younger years. With her items carefully tucked into her shopping bag, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment as she headed toward the exit. For her, this small trip to the mall represented more than just an errand. It was a reminder of her self-sufficiency, a chance to enjoy her day in her own quiet way. But as she approached the exit, her calm world was shattered when two mall security officers, towering and stern-faced, stepped directly into her path. Their cold, unyielding expressions told Margaret that they weren't about to let her pass, a sight that immediately made her heart skip a beat. As Mrs. Margaret Lewis made her way toward the mall's exit, a sense of satisfaction filled her heart. Her groceries were packed away neatly in her shopping bag, and she felt a small triumph in completing another day's errands independently. But just as she reached the sliding glass doors, two tall, stern security officers stepped directly into her path, blocking her from leaving. They wore matching dark uniforms, their arms crossed, and their piercing gazes fixed on her. Their expressions betrayed no kindness or understanding. Instead, there was an unsettling coldness in their eyes, as though they had already made up their minds about her. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a sudden, uneasy shift in the atmosphere. The taller officer cleared his throat, eyeing her with a look of suspicion that felt heavy and unyielding. His partner mirrored the expression, a look that seemed to cast a silent but damning judgment. "Ma'am, we need to have a word with you," the first officer stated, his tone sharp and accusatory. Margaret felt a wave of confusion wash over her, the edges of her initial confidence starting to fray. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but steady as she searched their faces for a hint of understanding. The officer took a step closer, his shadow looming over her as he spoke. "We received reports that you were shoplifting," he accused, his voice unyielding and laced with a harshness that sent a chill through Margaret's entire body. Margaret blinked, momentarily stunned by the accusation. "Shoplifting," she repeated, almost in disbelief. She clutched her cane a little tighter, feeling her hands begin to tremble ever so slightly. Her thoughts raced, trying to comprehend how such a misunderstanding could have occurred. She had always prided herself on her honesty and integrity, qualities that her community knew her for. The very idea of her stealing was preposterous, and yet, here she was, facing down these men who looked at her as though she were a criminal. "I've paid for everything," she insisted softly, her voice tinged with a quiet but unmistakable resolve. She reached a trembling hand into her shopping bag, her fingers fumbling slightly as she pulled out a small, crumpled receipt from the grocery store. "Here," she said, holding the receipt up for them to see, her eyes pleading for a moment of reason, for them to recognize that this was all just a mistake. But the officers didn't even glance at the receipt she offered. They exchanged a glance with each other, a look that spoke of certainty, as though her small act of defiance only further solidified their belief in her guilt. Margaret felt a pang of fear ripple through her, a growing sense of helplessness creeping into her heart. The taller officer leaned in, ignoring her extended hand and her proof of purchase. "We need you to come with us," he demanded, his tone final and devoid of any empathy. The words fell like a heavy weight upon her, and her heart began to race. Her body tensed as she tried to hold on to her composure, but the truth was, she was scared. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "There's been a mistake. I haven't taken anything that I haven't paid for." She looked around, hoping that someone nearby might notice her distress, but the few onlookers only stared, their faces a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a force that made her flinch. The suddenness of his grip caught her off guard, and she stumbled, her cane slipping in her grasp as she struggled to regain her balance. The realization hit her hard. These men didn't care about her innocence or her dignity. They had already made up their minds, and nothing she could say or show them seemed to matter. Margaret's vision blurred with tears, the humiliation stinging more sharply than she could have ever imagined. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, an elderly woman being manhandled in the middle of a crowded mall. The panic in her chest grew as she tried to pull her arm free, but the officer's grip only tightened, his determination to drag her away becoming painfully clear. Her breath came in shallow, trembling gasps as she glanced around one last time, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would intervene. In that desperate moment, Margaret realized she was truly alone in this struggle, her dignity slipping further with each second. As Mrs. Margaret Lewis stood frozen in shock, one of the officers reached out and grabbed her arm with a roughness that jolted her entire body. The suddenness of his grasp made her stumble, her feet struggling to find balance on the smooth, cold floor. Her purse slipped from her shoulder, falling open with a soft thud as items tumbled out. Her phone, a lifeline she kept close, skittered across the floor, far from her reach. But even more than the physical impact, it was the violation, the lack of respect in his grip, that struck her deeply. Pain shot through her arm as the officer's fingers dug in, his hand large and unrelenting. Margaret's free hand instinctively reached for her aching shoulder, and she felt herself shrinking inward, her body reacting to the distress and fear welling up inside her. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears, a frantic rhythm that made it difficult to focus, to think clearly. All she knew was that she had to explain herself, to make them understand. Yet each time she opened her mouth to protest, her voice was drowned out by the harsh voices and dismissive gestures of the men holding her. As she looked around the crowded mall, her desperation grew. She hoped to catch the eye of a kind passerby, someone who might intervene, someone who might understand that this was a misunderstanding. But every glance she met seemed to cast silent judgment. Strangers watched with curious stares, whispering to one another as if her guilt were an obvious truth. Their expressions held no empathy, no compassion, just a disinterested acceptance of what seemed, to them, like a clear case of wrongdoing. Margaret's cheeks flushed with shame as she felt the weight of the public's silent condemnation. In their eyes, she was guilty, and it felt as though her years of living honestly, her dedication to her family and community, had been reduced to nothing in the span of a few minutes. She tried to straighten herself, to hold on to the dignity she had always carried proudly. But the officer's iron grip kept her firmly in place, leaving her no choice but to endure the demeaning spectacle. "Please," she begged, her voice wavering, the plea laced with fear and desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've paid for everything. Please, just check my receipt." Her voice trailed off as she watched the officer ignore her words, his face impassive, his gaze fixed ahead. He had already made up his mind, and nothing she said seemed to make any difference. Tears began to pool in her eyes, blurring her vision as a deep, aching sense of helplessness took hold. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a vulnerability that left her feeling exposed and fragile. Her grip tightened around her cane as she tried to steady herself, but even that small gesture felt futile against the strength of the man holding her. Her dignity, something she had spent a lifetime building and protecting, felt as though it were slipping away with each passing second. With a sudden, sharp pull, the officer began to drag her towards the back of the store, his pace indifferent to her protests and pleas. Her feet stumbled to keep up, the pain in her arm intensifying with each tug. Margaret felt as though she were in a nightmare, each step bringing her further into a reality she couldn't control, couldn't escape. She cast one last pleading glance at the onlookers, silently begging them to step forward, to see her as a person rather than a spectacle. But no one moved. They merely watched, their murmurs adding to her sense of isolation. The officers ignored her pleas, her explanations, her tears. To them, she was not Mrs. Margaret Lewis, a woman with a lifetime of stories, kindness, and dignity. She was simply a suspect, and their treatment reflected that single, cold label. The pain in her arm was joined by a deeper, more intense ache in her heart, a wound formed not by physical force but by the humiliation of being treated as though her worth, her integrity, didn't matter. As they dragged her closer to the back room, Margaret felt her spirit falter. The realization that no one cared enough to help, that these men were indifferent to her suffering, weighed heavily on her. Her tears began to fall freely now, her cheeks wet with the grief of betrayal, of loneliness, of shame. She had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. In that moment, Margaret was not just an elderly woman accused of theft. She was a person stripped of her dignity, her humanity left shattered on the cold tile floor of a place she once visited with joy. As the officers continued to pull her through the mall, Mrs. Margaret Lewis felt her heart sink deeper into despair. Every step felt heavier, each tug at her arm a harsh reminder of the helplessness swallowing her whole. In her distress, a memory surfaced, a moment when her son, Daniel, had taken her hand, his voice filled with love and reassurance. "Mom, call me if you ever need help," he told her, a simple promise she had never thought she'd need to call upon. With trembling hands, she glanced down, her gaze falling on her phone, which had fallen to the floor amidst the chaos. Her fingers shook as she reached for it, her entire body weak from fear and humiliation. She managed to wrap her hand around the device, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline. Fumbling slightly, she unlocked the screen and scrolled to Daniel's number, pressing the call button with a mixture of relief and desperation. The phone rang once, then twice, each ring feeling like an eternity. And then, a familiar voice answered. "Mom." Daniel's voice was calm but instantly attentive, and that simple word nearly broke the dam of her emotions. She took a shallow breath, willing her voice to remain steady, but when she spoke, it came out as a fragile, trembling whisper. "Daniel, please, they're hurting me," she managed to say, her voice cracking with the weight of her fear and pain. She swallowed, trying to hold back the tears, but the desperation was too much to contain. "I don't know what to do. I didn't do anything wrong, but they won't listen to me." Daniel's voice was instantly firm, reassuring, a strength that seemed to flow through the phone and wrap around her like a comforting embrace. "Mom, I'm coming. Hold on, okay? Just stay calm. I'll be there soon." His words were steady, his tone laced with an unbreakable determination that she could almost feel, even through her pain. The quiet confidence in Daniel's voice soothed her just enough to steady her breathing. She held on to his promise like a lifeline, her grip on the phone tight as she nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Please, hurry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm on my way, Mom. I won't let anything happen to you. Just hold on," he replied with a conviction that made her heart swell with a faint glimmer of hope. As the call ended, Margaret felt a flicker of strength return. She was still afraid, still overwhelmed, but now she knew she wasn't alone. Her son was coming, and somehow she knew that everything would change the moment he arrived. Captain Daniel Lewis was a man renowned in his city for his composure and unwavering sense of justice. A dedicated officer, Daniel had worked his way up in the force, earning the respect of his colleagues and community alike. Though he carried the weight of his badge with responsibility, he was equally driven by his commitment to protect the innocent and vulnerable, a dedication that now burned with fierce urgency as he sped toward the mall. But this time, it was personal. This time, the person in need of protection was his own mother. As Daniel parked and hurried through the mall's bustling entrance, his pulse quickened, his gaze scanning the crowd until it locked onto a sight that made his heart drop. There, near the back of a store, he saw his mother, Mrs. Margaret Lewis, visibly shaken, her shoulders hunched, her face pale. She was held tightly by two large security officers, their hands gripping her arms with a carelessness that turned Daniel's stomach. The scene unfolding before him, the fear and distress on his mother's face, filled him with a potent mix of anger and sorrow, but his training kicked in. He knew he had to remain calm, calculated. With purposeful strides, Daniel approached the officers, his gaze fixed and unyielding. His presence was commanding, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers who began to murmur, sensing the tension in the air. Without a word, Daniel stopped just a few feet from the officers, his imposing figure making it clear that he wasn't a mere bystander. But the officers didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another concerned passerby, and they dismissed him with an air of irritation. "Sir, this is none of your business," one of the officers said curtly, his tone laced with authority. He shot Daniel a warning look, clearly expecting him to back down. "If you interfere, we'll have to take action," he added, his voice edged with impatience. Daniel, however, held his ground, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. His gaze shifted to his mother, who looked up, her eyes widening in relief at the sight of him. In that moment, his heart ached for her, but his resolve only strengthened. He turned back to the officers, his voice calm yet commanding. "This is very much my business," Daniel replied, his tone steady and unwavering. "You're holding my mother." The officers exchanged a surprised glance, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected revelation. But still, they held firm, clearly unconvinced that this man standing before them posed any real threat to their authority. One officer, attempting to reassert control, took a step forward, his posture rigid. "We don't care who you are," he replied with a dismissive scoff. "She's suspected of theft, and unless you want to find yourself involved, I suggest you step aside." Daniel's jaw clenched, his patience wearing thin, though he kept his expression controlled. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, holding it up with a quiet intensity. "Captain Daniel Lewis," he stated firmly, his voice resonating with authority. "City Police Department." The shift was instant. The officers' faces turned pale as they registered his rank, the weight of his position settling over them like a heavy shadow. The officer who had spoken first stumbled over his words, visibly rattled, realizing the gravity of his mistake. Daniel's unflinching gaze stayed locked on them, a silent reminder that they had crossed a line. The officer stammered, loosening his grip on Mrs. Lewis. We didn't know, sir," he managed, his tone faltering, as he hastily released her arm. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze cold as steel, his voice low and controlled. "That's precisely the problem," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "You didn't care to know. You saw an elderly woman and made assumptions, ignoring her right to respect and dignity. The crowd that had gathered watched in silent awe, their earlier judgments now replaced by shame and discomfort. Daniel placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, steadying her as she leaned gratefully into his support. But his gaze never left the officers, the warning clear in his eyes. Today, he would ensure that the wrongs they had committed would not go unanswered. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself as he looked into the eyes of the officers holding his mother. Despite the anger simmering beneath the surface, he knew he had to stay calm. He let his gaze fall briefly on his mother, the look of distress and exhaustion in her eyes strengthening his resolve. Turning back to the officers, he spoke with a tone of quiet intensity that cut through the tension. "That woman you're holding," he began, his voice carrying a weight that caused the officers to momentarily pause, "is my mother." The officers exchanged a quick, startled look, momentarily caught off guard. But the taller of the two quickly recovered, his face tightening as he tried to reassert his authority. "Sir, this is a security matter," he replied sharply, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "You need to step back, or we'll have no choice but to involve the police and have you removed." Daniel almost let out a humorless chuckle at the irony, but he remained composed. Instead, he simply reached into his jacket and drew out his badge, holding it up with steady hands for both officers to see. "Captain Daniel Lewis," he announced, his voice a shade cooler now. "City Police Department." The impact was immediate. The officers' faces drained of color, the realization of who they were dealing with settling over them like a heavy, uncomfortable weight. The officer who had just spoken visibly recoiled, his posture faltering as he stammered, "Captain, we had no idea." Daniel's face remained unyielding as he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at them. "That's right, you didn't," he replied, his tone calm yet firm. "You didn't bother to listen to her, to even check the proof she offered." His gaze was piercing, a silent reprimand that made both officers shift uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating under his scrutiny. He turned his head slightly and gestured toward his mother's shopping bag, his expression one of restrained but unmistakable anger. "You had all the means to verify her story. A simple glance at her receipt would have told you she paid for everything in that bag," he continued, each word like a carefully aimed blow. "Yet you chose to ignore that. Instead, you treated her like a criminal without a shred of respect or dignity." The officers stood frozen, each word weighing heavily as Daniel's authority now completely overtook the dynamic. The crowd around them watched in silence, some with guilt in their eyes for their previous judgment of Mrs. Lewis. The officers, who had earlier shown no hesitation in asserting their control, now looked small and defenseless, their defiance replaced by shame and regret. Daniel's voice softened, but his tone remained deadly serious as he issued his next command. "Now, I want you to let go of my mother. And then, you're going to apologize and verify her receipt, something that should have been done from the start." The officers quickly complied, their hands releasing Mrs. Lewis's arms as they stepped back, mumbling hurried apologies. One of them reached into her shopping bag and pulled out the crumpled receipt she'd offered earlier, his face paling further as he glanced over it, confirming that she had indeed paid for every item. With his mother finally free from their hold, Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his gaze still fixed on the officers. "Let this be a reminder," he said quietly, his words directed at them but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "that every individual deserves to be treated with respect and fairness. Perhaps next time, you'll choose to remember that." The officers hung their heads, visibly chastened, as Daniel led his mother away, his protective stance a clear signal that, in this case, justice had indeed turned the tables. The officers, now faced with the full weight of their mistake, began to stammer out apologies, their once confident demeanor crumbling in the presence of Captain Daniel Lewis. The arrogance and authority they had so easily wielded earlier were now replaced by guilt and discomfort. They avoided meeting his gaze, their faces pale as Daniel's words echoed in their minds. Seeing his mother, an elderly woman who had clearly suffered both physically and emotionally from their actions, only heightened their sense of shame. We're sorry, sir. We didn't realize," one officer mumbled, his voice barely audible, as if he understood that no excuse could justify their behavior. The other officer added a hesitant apology, his eyes downcast. Yet Daniel's unflinching gaze did not soften. He remained silent, waiting, his eyes demanding an answer to the question that hung heavily in the air. After a long, tense moment, Daniel broke the silence. "Why?" he asked, his tone unwavering. "Why didn't you just give her the basic respect of checking her receipt?" His words were calm, but the force behind them was unmistakable. "She offered you proof, and you ignored it. Instead, you humiliated her, dragged her through this mall as though she were a criminal." His voice lowered, each word striking with precise intensity. "Do you even realize the harm you caused? The fear, the humiliation." The officers squirmed, unable to respond. They knew there was no answer that could justify their actions, no excuse that could repair the damage they'd done. Satisfied that his message had sunk in, Daniel straightened, his tone now bearing a finality that left no room for argument. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs about this," he stated, his voice cool and authoritative. "Your behavior here was unacceptable, and I intend to ensure there are consequences. No one, especially an elderly woman, should have to endure what my mother just went through." The officers' faces flushed, their regret deepening as they processed the repercussions that now loomed ahead. They mumbled one last apology, but Daniel had already turned away, his focus shifting back to his mother. He gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, offering her the support she had been so unfairly denied. Her hand still trembled slightly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. "It's over now, Mom," Daniel murmured softly, his voice filled with warmth as he looked into her tearful eyes. "You're safe. I'm here." Mrs. Lewis managed a small, weary smile, her fingers tightening around his arm as if drawing strength from his presence. The crowd that had gathered was now dispersing, some individuals looking down, ashamed of their own silence during the ordeal. Daniel shielded his mother from their lingering glances, gently guiding her away from the scene and leading her toward the exit. As they walked, he held her close, ensuring she felt secure in every step. The rage and sorrow he'd felt at seeing her mistreated still lingered in his chest, but now it was tempered by gratitude. Gratitude that she was unharmed, that he had arrived in time to stand by her side. He couldn't erase the pain she had endured, but he could offer her the assurance that she was loved and protected. Together, they left the mall, stepping out into the open air where the weight of the ordeal slowly began to lift. Daniel held her hand a little tighter, his voice gentle as he whispered, "You don't have to worry about anything, Mom. I'll always be here for you." As Margaret and Daniel walked out of the mall together, Margaret clung tightly to her son's arm. Her face, still bearing the traces of fear and pain, softened as she looked at him, her eyes welling up with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Despite the trauma she had just endured, she felt a deep sense of comfort, knowing her son had been there to stand by her side when she needed him most. Justice had been served, but the sting of humiliation still lingered, leaving her both grateful and saddened. Daniel placed a reassuring hand over hers as they walked, his expression filled with resolve. The events of the day had shaken him, not only as a son but as a police captain sworn to protect people like his mother. Seeing her suffer at the hands of those who were meant to safeguard public trust weighed heavily on him. The experience ignited a stronger commitment within him, to fight for respect and fair treatment for all, especially for those who were often misjudged or overlooked. He knew he would ensure that those responsible would be held accountable, using this incident as a lesson to remind others of the power and duty of compassion. As they reached the car, Daniel helped his mother inside, then took a moment to gather himself. The ordeal had left a mark on them both, but it also underscored the power of standing together in the face of prejudice. Margaret may have faced fear and humiliation, but through it all, her son had been there, unwavering, a reminder that family is the strongest shield against injustice. With a renewed sense of strength, Margaret looked up at him, her expression soft yet firm. She knew now, more than ever, that her son would always be there to make things right, just as he had today. And as they drove away, a quiet sense of justice lingered, a testament to the impact of family, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Would you have found and create something positive out of a painful experience? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this story as much as we did, I handpicked this next one that will warm your heart. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it.